Lesson 54: Politics and Society in the Me Decade. How should historians characterize the 1970s? Introduction. On July 4th, 1976, the United States celebrated the bicentennial, or 200th anniversary, of the signing of the United States Declaration of Independence. Across the nation, Americans marked the day with parades, picnics, and fireworks displays. The celebration surpassed normal Independence Day festivities, lasting most of the year. The U.S. Mint issued coins with bicentennial designs, television networks featured programs exploring the nation's first 2 centuries, and Americans flew bicentennial flags. To many Americans, the bicentennial ushered in a welcome feeling of national pride. The celebrations, which focused on the nation's founding ideals, were relief after the trauma of Vietnam and the disillusionment of Watergate. For others, the bicentennial eliminated the disparity between the nation's founding ideals and its current ones. They worried that the United States had lost its sense of purpose. A journalist named Tom Wolfe captured these bicentennial concerns in his essay The Me Decade and the Third Great Awakening by documenting changes he had witnessed in American life since the end of the 1960s. In the 1960s, he noted idealistic Americans had struggled to end racism, fight poverty, and create a more just society. Wolfe claimed that the drive for social change had been replaced in the 1970s with a quest for self-improvement and personal fulfillment. "We are now in the me decade," he wrote, seeing the upward roll, the third great religious wave in American history. "The focus of this latest great awakening," Wolfe observed, "is the most fascinating subject on earth, me." Wolfe's characterization of the 1970s as the Me Decade stuck, yet historians view the 1970s as much more complex than the label Me Decade suggests. A time of economic and political malaise. When Gerald Ford became president in 1974, he inherited numerous political problems from his predecessor. Although the United States had withdrawn from Vietnam, war continued in the region. Ford's controversial pardoning of Richard Nixon morally divided the nation. Furthermore, the economy continued to suffer from stagflation, the severity of which Ford emphasized in a speech to Congress. "Inflation, our public enemy number one, will, unless whipped, destroy our country, our homes, our liberties, our property, and finally our national pride, as surely as any well-armed wartime enemy. President Ford tries to whip inflation now. Whip inflation now. Many factors caused the inflation that affected the U.S. economy in the 1970s. For one, President Johnson's decision to escalate the war in Vietnam while simultaneously launching a war on poverty drove inflation. Military and welfare spending tend to be inflationary because they introduce more money into the economy without increasing the supply of goods. When too many dollars chase too few goods, prices rise. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, augmented this problem by raising oil prices. Formed in 1960, OPEC is an association of nations whose national incomes depend on oil sales. OPEC priced oil at $2 to $3 per barrel until the 1973 embargo, which revealed the degree of many countries' dependence on imported oil. OPEC began to increase oil prices after the embargo, and by 1976, the cost of one barrel of oil had risen to $12. Soaring oil prices hurt the U.S. economy as products using oil as a raw material became more costly to produce. Plus, rising fuel prices increased the cost of moving goods from farms and factories to consumers. Stunned by high gas prices, drivers temporarily stopped purchasing American-made gas-guzzling cars. As their sales plummeted, auto manufacturers laid off more than 225,000 workers in 1974. President Ford tried to quash rising prices with a crusade called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN, which reduced federal spending and urged Americans to conserve energy and practice thrift. "Clean up your plate before you leave the table," the president advised. "Guard your health." WIN was ultimately not effective, and prices continued to rise, increasing by a margin of 11% in 1975. The unemployment rate grew more than 8%, the highest rate since the Depression's end. An outsider in the White House, Jimmy Carter. The 1976 presidential election pitted Ford against former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, a Washington outsider untouched by scandal. Carter appealed to American voters, promising, "I will never lie to you." Neither candidate generated much excitement, and as election day neared, Americans discussed a clothespin vote in which constituents hold their nose and vote for one or the other. Only 53% of eligible voters went to the polls, the lowest voter turnout since 1948. Carter won by a narrow margin. President Carter maintained his outsider status in the White House, hiring staff from Georgia instead of experienced Washington insiders. He also failed to establish close relations with Congress. As a result, Carter's effort to enact reforms like creating a national health insurance system were unsuccessful. Carter's energy program, the moral equivalent of war. Convinced that the era of cheap energy had ended, President Carter called on Americans to face the fact that the energy shortage is permanent. Soon after taking office in 1977, Carter introduced a plan to end the nation's dependence on imported oil, an effort called the moral equivalent of war. Carter's energy plan centered on conservation. He told Congress it is the cheapest, most practical way to meet our energy needs and to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Lawmakers were unconvinced by Carter's plan, which intended to penalize energy waste and encourage energy efficiency. Reporters referred to Carter's moral equivalent of war as meow, implying that Congress would not take it seriously. Late in 1978, Congress passed a watered-down version of Carter's original plan called the National Energy Act. This act offered tax credits as incentives for people to conserve energy, either by insulating their homes or investing in alternative energy sources such as solar energy panels. Tax credits to reduce the amount of taxes a taxpayer owes to the government. The National Energy Act increased the nation's energy efficiency, but it did not reduce Americans' dependence on foreign oil. In 1979, a second energy crisis was triggered by a revolution in Iran, which subsequently halted its oil exports. Over the next year, oil prices rose to a staggering $39.50 per barrel. Long lines reappeared at American gas stations and fistfights erupted among frustrated motorists. Americans face a crisis of confidence. As at the low approval rating of 25%, Carter planned to redress the issue of conserving energy with the nation. However, after a week of discussion with various advisors, Carter altered the message of his speech. I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. Carter told the nation in a televised address, I want to talk to you right now about the fundamental threat to American democracy is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul of the spirit of national will. We see it in the crisis of growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and the loss of unity and purpose for our nation. In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but what one owns. We've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. Jimmy Carter, Crisis of Confidence speech, July 15th, 1979. This address, which the media dubbed Carter's malaise speech, describing a feeling of general unease, backfired. The American people did not receive President Carter's address positively. There is nothing wrong with the American people, newspaper editorials claimed. Maybe the problem's in the White House. Maybe we need a new leadership to guide us. President Carter's approach to foreign policy. After Carter took office in 1976, it became clear that his approach to foreign policy differed from Richard Nixon's realpolitik. Whereas Nixon had prided himself on realism, Carter emphasized idealism in foreign affairs and insisted that the government not separate foreign policy from questions of justice, equity, and human rights. Fairness and not force, Carter urged, should lie in the heart of our dealings with the nations of the world. Promoting justice, equality, and human rights. Carter struggled to realize his foreign policy ideals. He was successful in resolving certain issues, like establishing a more equitable relations with Panama. Panamanians had long regarded a 1903 treaty between the two countries, which gave the United States permanent control of the Panama Canal, as unjust. In 1977, Carter negotiated a treaty that would return control of the canal to Panama. In 1999, despite strong objections, the Senate ratified the Panama Canal Treaty in 1978. The degree of Carter's success in human rights policy was more varied. At the start of his presidency, Carter was determined to end the United States Cold War tendency to support dictators who opposed communism, even if they abused human rights. When leftist rebels in Nicaragua ousted the country's anti-communist dictator in 1979, Carter adhered to his policy of non-intervention. However, he continued to support dictators with poor human rights policies in other parts of the world, including the Philippines, Indonesia, and Indonesia, that Carter believed were vital to U.S. interests. A step toward Middle East peace, the Camp David Accords. Carter's greatest foreign policy achievements were in the Middle East. In 1978, he invited the leaders of Egypt and Israel to commence peace talks at Camp David, a presidential retreat in Maryland, Egypt, and Israel had been adversaries in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, during which Israel gained control of land that had previously belonged to its neighbors. Israel's occupied territories included Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. At Camp David, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat conversed for 13 tense days. Finally, they reached an agreement called the Camp David Accords, which provided a framework for peace between the two countries. Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and Egypt agreed to diplomatic relations with Israel. Egypt became the first Arab country to formally recognize Israel as a country, in which Arab nations had opposed since Israel's establishment in 1948. In 1979, Sadat and Benin jointly received the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to end hostilities between their countries. Presenting the award, the chairman of the Nobel Committee spoke of Carter's work, claiming the president was the master builder responsible for the bridge that brought the one-time enemies together to talks of peace. The death of détente between the United States and the USSR. As president, both Nixon and Ford pursued a policy of détente towards the USSR. Carter openly criticized the Soviet Union's human rights record, but cooperated with the Soviet leaders to negotiate a second strategic arms limitation treaty, SALT II. In a speech before the United Nations, Carter stated, "Peace will not be assured until the weapons of war are finally put away." Détente efforts dissolved when Soviet troops marched into Afghanistan in 1979 to assist the country's failing communist government in subduing rebellion. Deeming this invasion the most serious threat to world peace since World War II, Carter promoted a boycott of the Olympic Games, which was scheduled to be held in Moscow the following summer. A hostage crisis in Iran. The Nixon Doctrine fared little better than détente during the Carter presidency. As part of the Nixon Doctrine's policy, the United States increased military aid to Iran in the 1970s. In return, the United States expected Iran's royal ruler, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to help maintain stability in the Persian Gulf. Carter continued to support the Shah despite his poor human rights record until revolution swept through Iran in January of 1979. Under a religious leader, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the Revolutionary Army declared Iran a republic and forced the Shah into exile. Khomeini then established a new government based on strict adherence to Islamic principles. Later that year, Carter allowed the exiled Shah to enter the United States for medical treatment, enraging many Iranians. On November 4th, 1979, militant students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital. In violation of the international law protecting diplomats, the students took 66 Americans hostage. They paraded the hostage through the streets of Tehran, where angry crowds shouted, "Death to Carter! Death to Carter!" Carter struggled to bring the hostages home for over a year. Appeals to the United Nations and other U.S. allies for assistance in securing the hostages' release accomplished little, so Carter ordered a military rescue in April of 1980. The mission failed when 2 helicopters had engine troubles, a third was damaged while landing, and a fourth crashed, killing 8 Americans. The hostage crisis angered Americans, some of whom directed their outrage at Iran. Texans displayed signs urging "Don't buy Iranian oil." Other Americans blamed Carter's fairness, not forced foreign policy strategy. Wild as he is, stated former Energy Secretary James Schlesinger, the Ayatollah Khomeini would not have touched the Soviet embassy. 52 of the hostages were released. Of the hostages were not released until Carter left office in January of 1981, after enduring 444 days in captivity. Jimmy Carter shakes hands with Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin after the Camp David Accords were signed on September 17, 1978. The accords established diplomatic relations between Israel and Egypt. The agreement also marked a high point in Carter's Middle Eastern peace efforts. Protecting the environment. On April 22nd, 1970, Americans celebrated the first annual Earth Day. Across the country, nearly 20 million people united to demonstrate their concern for the environment. Some held marches while others organized cleanup projects. The establishment sees this as the great big anti-litter campaign, observed George Brown, a California congressman, but Earth Day proved to be far more influential. Polls in 1970 showed that many Americans believed the environment was the nation's most pressing domestic issue. The environmental movement emerges. Earth Day's success prompted the emergence of a grassroots environmental movement. Some groups, such as the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club, had existed for many years. The Sierra Club was founded in 1892 under the leadership of John Muir and conservationists to enjoy and protect the mountains of the West. Over time, the club expanded its mission to include preserving wilderness and protecting the environment throughout the nation. In the 1970s, the Sierra Club's membership expanded from 100,000 to nearly 200,000 people. In addition, new organizations were created to respond to environmental concerns. Some dealt with local problems such as cleaning rivers and establishing recycling programs, while others focused on national and global issues. A group called Zero Population Growth, ZPG, formed in 1968 to raise awareness of rapid population growth's role in accelerating the environmental destruction. With the slogan of "Stop at 2," ZPG encouraged families to stay small. A decade of environmental legislation. In response to increasing public concern, Congress enacted a number of environmental laws during the 1970s. Soon after the first Earth Day in 1970, Congress approved legislation to create the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which aimed to repair existing environmental damage and to prevent further destruction. The EPA grew quickly. By the end of the decade, it had become the government's largest regulatory agency, comprising over 10,000 employees. Air pollution was a major environmental concern during the 1970s. In 1970, Congress amended the Clean Air Act of 1963, setting stricter emissions standards for automobiles, factories, and power plants. In 1977, lawmakers amended the act again, this time to strengthen the air quality standards. Congress also addressed the issue of water pollution. In 1969, Americans were shocked when the polluted Cuyahoga River burst into flames in Cleveland, Ohio. The Clean Water Act of 1972 limited the amount of sewage and other pollutants flowing into the waterways, while the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 enabled the EPA to regulate public drinking water quality. The EPA also worked to eliminate another source of water pollution called acid rain. Acid rain is the precipitation that contains acid as a result of water vapor mixing with molecules of sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen in the atmosphere. These pollutants are released into the atmosphere by automobiles, factories, and power plants that burn fossil fuels. Acid rain can harm plants and animals and is powerful enough to corrode buildings and other stone structures. During the 1970s, the EPA set limits on car pollution levels. By 1975, manufacturers were equipping cars with catalytic converters, devices that remove pollutants from cars' exhaust. In 1979, the EPA required that coal-fired power plants use smokestack scrubbers to remove exhaust pollutants. This technology was widely adopted in the 1980s. Environmental disasters fuel public concern. Two well-publicized environmental disasters in the 1970s underscored public concern about environmental hazards. The first of these incidents occurred in the Love Canal, a neighborhood in Niagara, New York. The Love Canal residents unknowingly lived atop a chemical waste dump, exposing them to poisons. As a result, residents developed unusually high rates of cancer and birth defects. When officials uncovered the roots of the community's health problems in 1978, Love Canal became a media storm. The federal government eventually relocated 800 Love Canal families to safer areas, while Congress passed laws requiring companies to thoroughly clean their toxic waste sites. The second disaster of the decade occurred at Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station. On March 28, 1979, the nuclear power plant suffered a partial meltdown. Although the situation was eventually controlled, some radioactive gases escaped into the atmosphere. The 3 Mile Island accident convinced many Americans that nuclear power plants posed an unacceptable risk to human beings and the natural environment. No new nuclear power plants have been built in the United States since 1979. Clean drinking water is essential to human health. By the 1970s, however, the water supply in some areas had become so polluted by chemicals, sewage, or pesticides that it was unsafe to drink. The Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 was designed to protect public health by setting national standards for safe drinking water. Since 1974, the law has been amended to protect drinking water at its source, such as rivers, lakes, springs, and wells. Before 1974, pesticide, fertilizer application, private drinking wells, mining, draining, and then they protected all this stuff after 1974. Women continue their struggle for equality. On September 20th, 1973, professional tennis player Billie Jean King played an aging former Wimbledon champion Bobby Riggs. Billed as the Battle of the Sexes, this tennis match was anything but ordinary. Riggs proudly admitted to being a male chauvinist, someone who believes that men are superior to women. He boasted that he could defeat King, even at the age of 55, because she was a woman. In a match that 50 million people watched on television, King handily defeated Riggs. To many viewers, King's victory represented the current strides women were making in sports and in greater society. Women challenged gender segregation in the workplace. During the 1970s, record numbers of women entered professional trades dominated by men. The decade saw a 144% increase in the number of female accountants, as well as doubling the number of female chemists. In 1972, only about 4% of the nation's lawyers were women. A figure rose to 13% by 1980. Additionally, at the end of the 1970s, 1 in 5 American medical students was female. Although encouraging these numbers distort the complexity of gender relations of the 1970s, during this decade, most women operated in a workplace segregated by gender. Men did certain jobs, while women did others. In addition, jobs designated for women often paid less than their male counterparts. For example, nurses, most of whom were women, earned less than truck drivers, a profession mostly of men. To address this inequality, feminists in the late 1970s launched a campaign for what they called comparable worth. Advocates of comparable worth argued that jobs typically held by women, like nursing, should receive comparable pay to jobs typically held by men that require comparable education and training. In this way, a highly trained nurse would earn more money than a less skilled truck driver. These arguments convinced many employers to reevaluate their pay practices, some of whom agreed to increase pay for certain traditionally female jobs. Feminists also addressed barriers preventing women from entering higher-paying jobs. One such obstacle was men's reluctance to promote women to management roles in most workplaces. Women described this barrier as the glass ceiling, allowing them to rise only so far as in a company, but no higher. Eventually, women began to shatter this glass ceiling, proving not only that they could handle management responsibility, but also that men could work under female bosses. Another obstacle was a shortage of affordable childcare. Without childcare, many women took part-time or less demanding jobs, which usually paid less. In order to have greater flexibility to care for their children, feminists lobbied for employers and government officials to establish and help fund childcare centers for working parents. The lack of affordable childcare was part of a larger problem called the feminization of poverty. Poverty rates for all Americans declined during the 1960s, but this decade was more significant for men than for women. In the 1970s, women were much more likely than men to be poor. Single mothers supporting children were especially prone to poverty. Feminists addressed this problem in a number of ways. For one, they worked to achieve fair compensation for divorced women and their children. Feminists persuaded government officials to ensure that divorced mothers received the child support payments that they had been awarded in their divorce settlements. Feminists also sought stricter penalties for divorced fathers who did not meet their financial obligations for their families. Women increased their political clout. To engender such reform, many women entered politics. During the 1970s, a growing number of women voted, ran for public office, and worked for reform in public policy. The National Women's Political Caucus, NWPC, formed in 1971 by feminist leaders, encouraged women's activism and raised money to help women get elected to office. The NWPC also funded male candidates with progressive stances on women's issues. With their increased political participation, women quickly became more influential in their political parties. In 1968, only 13% of Democratic National Convention delegates were women. Boosted by their efforts, the NWPC women accounted for 40% of the convention's delegates in 1972. Women Republican Party members also increased their representation at national conventions, growing from 17% of delegates in 1968 to 30% in 1972. Women also accumulated influence with elected officials by voting more than men. Because of this, election candidates could no longer risk failing to address women's concerns. In addition, Congress voted in 1972 to prohibit discrimination against women in the armed forces, in the armed services at the national level. Under pressure from women voters, state legislatures formed laws that had made it nearly impossible to prosecute cases of sexual assault against women. Women also worked with local governments and school boards to ensure that their daughters were granted the same opportunities as their sons. Shirley Chisholm, pictured here, founded NWPC with Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinman. In 1972, Representative Shirley Chisholm made a historic bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. Announcing her candidacy, Chisholm stated, "I am not a candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not a candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman. I am equally proud of that. I am a candidate of the people." In 1964, the gender gap in voter turnout was less than 2%. By 1980, the gap had widened to over 5%. By voting in greater numbers than men did, women increased their political influence among elected officials. During the 1970s, more women launched careers in fields previously considered men's work. By the end of the decade, it was no longer surprising to see women working at construction sites, delivering televised weather reports, or defending clients in the courtroom. However, most workplaces in the 1970s continued to be segregated to segregate jobs by gender. Technology reshapes how people work and play. In May of 1977, the first installment of the Star Wars epic was released in movie theaters. With its dazzling computer-generated special effects and fast-paced action, the film became a blockbuster hit. Star Wars was so popular with moviegoers of all ages, in fact, that it revived the science fiction film genre. In addition, the movie showcased innovation in computer technology. By the 1970s, technological innovations were transforming everything from movies to medicine. The microprocessor shrinks computing devices. Computing machines began to influence how Americans worked as early as the 1950s. However, the first computers were large and complicated to use. During the 1970s, new technologies replaced bulky vacuum tubes and transistors with teeny silicon chips, inspiring a computer revolution. For the first time, ordinary Americans could easily purchase and use a personal computer or PC. Microprocessors were introduced in 1971, facilitating the invention of the PC. In essence, a processor is a computer's brain. It performs the basic operation that enables a computer to do work. A microprocessor integrates all of the elements of a processor on a piece of silicon called a chip. As smaller silicon chips were invented, computers and other computing devices began to shrink in size. The microprocessor inspired an array of new inventions, one of which was the pocket-sized calculator. The first of these, called the Baumeister brain, hit the U.S. market in 1971. Unlike bulky adding machines, this mini number cruncher was only a little more than 5 inches high and 3 inches wide. With a $245 price tag, the Bowman brain was initially a luxury item. But as the supply of pocket calculators grew to meet people's increasing demand, prices dropped significantly. Another popular new product based on the microprocessor technology was the video game. The first successful video game was the ball and paddle game called Pong, which first appeared in game arcades in 1972. In 1975, Pong's manufacturer, Atari, released a home version of the game in the form of a video game console. That console connected to a television. To company executives' surprise, Atari sold 150,000 units that year. During the 1975 holiday season, people waited in line for hours to purchase a Pong-on-chip powered home video game. In 1977, a California-based company called Apple Computer released a computer that was small and cheap enough to use at home. By modern standards, the Apple II was slow and had a minuscule memory. Yet the Apple II launched the personal computer revolution, selling at a price that middle-class families could afford. Families, businesses, and schools purchased more than 2 million Apple IIs between 1977 and 1993, the end of the computer's production. more than 2 million Apple IIs between 1977 and 1993, the end of the computer's production. Of medical advances. In the 1970s, numerous medical advances improved healthcare. Inspired by the success of the polio vaccine, researchers developed vaccines for other childhood diseases. By 1971, scientists had developed a combination vaccine to prevent measles, mumps, and rubella, or German measles. Other medical advances provided options for women who had difficulty getting pregnant. In 1978, the first test tube baby was born in England. In these cases, a woman's egg is fertilized outside of her body in a process called in vitro, meaning in glass, because it occurs in a glass test tube or dish. Then the doctor implants the fertilized egg into the woman's womb and pregnancy proceeds as normal. The first American test tube baby was born in 1981. Although the practice remains controversial, more than 40,000 babies are born in the United States each year through in vitro fertilization. Microwaves and movies at home. The invention of two electronic devices shaped Americans' homes and lives in the 1970s. The first of these was the microwave oven. Although microwave technology had existed since the 1940s, Raytheon did not produce a microwave oven for home use until the late 1960s. Microwave ovens bombard food waves with radio waves. As the waves passed through the food, they set the molecules of water, fat, sugar, and other elements into rapid motion. This motion causes friction, which creates heat. Foods that take an hour to cook in a conventional oven heat in minutes in a microwave, a feature that appealed to the growing number of working women. The second electronic device to transform America's home life was the video cassette recorder, or VCR, which enabled people to record TV programs on videotape and replay them later. VCR, which enabled people to record TV programs, videotape, replay them later. VCR users could also play pre-recorded tapes of movies and videotapes they had made using video cameras or camcorders. VCRs reshaped American entertainment in the 1970s. Previously, people watched movies at theaters or at home on television broadcast, but with the VCR, movie fans could rent or buy videotapes of movies to watch at any time. In addition, television show viewers no longer had to organize their schedule around broadcast times. In 1971, the microprocessor contributed to the development of the pocket calculators, personal computers, and CT scanners. This teeny chip enabled the shrinking of these devices, leading to a personal technologies revolution in the 1970s. The first home video games and computers were invented with the help of microprocessors. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple Computers in 1976. 2 years later, Apple Computer released the Apple II, an affordable personal computer that revolutionized how people could use computers at home and at work. Over the next 35 years, Jobs continued to advance personal computing devices until his death in 2011. Section 6, the baby bust and retirement boom. In 1971, a new landmark appeared in the Arizona desert. It was the London Bridge. The Old English bridge was always falling down in nursery rhymes. Built in 1831, the London Bridge had become a victim of its own great weight. London officials announced in 1962 that the bridge was sinking into the Thames River and would have to be torn down. Instead, an American businessman named Robert McCulloch purchased the bridge and had it transported stone by stone to Arizona. Workers reassembled the bridge in Teeny Lake Havasu City, a resort community that McCulloch was developing in the Arizona desert. As McCulloch had hoped, the relocated London Bridge attracted people to his real estate development. Many of Lake Havasu City's visitors were older people who chose to retire in the community. In this way, Lake Havasu City became one of the numerous Sunbelt cities populated by the aging U.S. population of the 1970s. A baby bust begins the aging of America. During the post-World War II baby boom, the average age of the U.S. population decreased. This trend reversed in the 1970s as the U.S. population aged. The average age of Americans increased. This shift was particularly caused by declining birth rates. At the peak of the baby boom of 1957, the average American family had 3 to 4 children. Between 1975 and 1980, that figure. With longer lives, Americans redefine retirement. Longer life expectancies meant Americans who retired in the 1970s had more retirement years than earlier generations had. In addition, the post-World War II economic boom provided many Americans sufficient money for retirement. Many retirees owned their own homes, and most had pensions from years of working for one employer. Retirees also benefited from the expansion of Social Security and Medicare benefits in the 1960s and 1970s. In 1950, approximately 33% of older Americans lived in poverty, but by 1978, only 14% were poor. With these changes, older Americans began to redefine retirement as a period of fun, travel, and relocation. A growing number of older Americans, especially those living in northern states, sold their homes and moved to the Sun Belt. Other retirees, called snowbirds, traveled seasonally, moving from place to place. Resort communities like Lake Havasu attracted mobile retirees who visited to boat and golf during the winter months. Population and power shift from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. The migration of Americans from northern to southern states catalyzed shifts in economic and political power. Fast-growing Sunbelt states saw their economies grow with the influx of residents and new businesses. In contrast, the Northeast and Midwest suffered economically. Portions of these regions became known as the Rust Belt, named for the rusting factories that declining industries abandoned. Even well-established Rust Belt industries such as steel milling and automobile assembly struggled to survive the stagflation of the 1970s. Many laid-off workers migrated to the Sun Belt in search of work. The political clout of Sunbelt states increased along with their populations. After each census, seats in the House of Representatives and are reapportioned to reflect population changes. States with expanded populations gained seats in the House and therefore votes in the Electoral College. Since the 1970s, Sunbelt states have gained more than 35 electoral votes at the expense of Rust Belt states. From 1964 to 2004, every successful presidential candidate hailed from a Sunbelt state. Looking for meaning and fun in daily life. Some Americans looked inward in the 1970s, exploring their identity and beliefs. Others found joy in the decade's various fads and fashions. The Third Great Awakening, Self-Improvement and Spirituality. When Tom Wolfe wrote The Third Great Awakening in the 1970s, he contemplated two broad movements. He named the first of these the therapeutic movement, which focused on self-improvement through some form of therapy or treatment. A variety of self-improvement activities emerged during the decade. Their common goal, observed Wolfe, was to change one's personality, remaking, remodeling, elevating, and polishing one's very self. The second broad movement was more spiritual in nature. In the 1970s witnessed an explosion of new religious groups, some of which were based on Eastern religious traditions, mainly Buddhism and Hinduism. Buddhist meditation and Hindu practice of yoga both gained a large following. One group, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, originated in India. Members of this group regularly chant a mantra or a set of sacred words to bring about a higher spiritual awareness. The mantra begins with the phrase Hare Krishna, or O Lord Krishna, so this group is commonly known as the Hare Krishnas. Other new religious groups drew from outside influences. One of the most successful of these groups was the Unification Church, which was founded by a Korean religious leader named Sung Myung Moon. In 1972, Moon moved to the United States and expanded his faith movement, called Moonies, by people outside the church. His followers rapidly grew in number. In 1982, Moon made headlines for presiding over a mass marriage of 2,075 couples in New York's Madison Square Garden. Moon had selected many of the couples to marry. Exploring identity, ethnicity, and diversity. For some, turning inward meant exploring one's cultural identity. This was especially true for the descendants of immigrants from Italy, Poland, and elsewhere in Southern and Eastern Europe. When they arrived to the United States, these immigrants were expected to assimilate or melt into society dominated by WASPs, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. As novelist James T. Farrell observed in 1972, the melting pot was essentially an Anglo-Saxon effort to rub out the past of others. In his 1973 book, The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethics, Michael Novak emphasized many ethnic groups' stubborn survival. He invited readers to explore the ethnic identities by asking questions like, who, after all, are you? What history brought you here, where you are? Where are you? Why are you different from others? In answering these questions, many Americans reclaimed their ethnic backgrounds as heritage to be proud of, not a past to leave behind. This renewed interest in ethnicity or ethnic identity soon influenced politics. In 1974, President Ford established the Office of Ethnic Awards. The growing awareness of ethnic diversity also affected popular culture. Movies like The Godfather and Saturday Night Fever portrayed ethnic groups whose values and traditions often differed from the audience's identities. The creators of the television show Sesame Street, which debuted in 1969, carefully constructed the program to reflect the nation's diversity. Sesame Street took place on a fictional street where people of different backgrounds lived and worked. The puppets on the show interacted with an African American couple, a Latina woman, and people with disabilities. Fun, fads, and funky fashions. The 1970s also had a fun, less serious side. Disco, a genre of music loved by some and loathed by others, drew young people to dance clubs called discotheques, where disc jockeys kept records spinning and dancers dancing long into the night. As one disco fan recalled, with its driving beats, disco almost had a hypnotic feel that made you want to dance. It's really hard to sit still when you hear a good disco tune. The decade had various silly fads such as the pet rock craze. Pet rocks are rocks individually packed in boxes resembling pet carrying cases. Another fad called streaking involved running naked through public places. One streaker ran across the stage during the 1974 Academy Awards ceremony. The 1970s also saw a flowering of funky fashions, including platform shoes, polyester leisure suits, and hot pants. The bell-bottom pants crowd shifted from hippies to housewives. Also popular were mood rings, which supposedly changed color to match a wearer's mood. A black ring signaled stress, while blue meant the wearer was relaxed or in a romantic state of mind. During the 1970s, the U.S. economy suffered from stagflation as the nation faced a number of crises. That decade was also a time of changing views about everything from environment and ethnicity to retirement and gender equality. Organization of petroleum exporting countries. A major cause of inflation was OPEC's decision to raise the price of oil, which led to an increase in prices for many goods. National Energy Act. In 1978, Congress worked to reduce the U.S. dependence on imported oil. The National Energy Act offered incentives for conserving energy and using alternative energy sources. Camp David Accords, 1978, Jimmy Carter brokered a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. The Camp David Accords ended the long-standing war between these two countries. Earth Day, the first day celebration in 1970, signaled an emergence of a new environmental movement. Followers worked to clean up and protect the environment both locally and globally. Congress passed anti-pollution laws such as the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. 3 Mile Island accident. An accident at 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station in 1978 highlighted the potential dangers of nuclear energy. Searching for meaning. During the 1970s, many Americans turned inward to search for meaning. Some explored self-help movements, new religions, or other ethnic identities. Population changes. Few births and longer life expectancies led to an aging of the U.S. population. The population also shifted as people migrated from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. Gender equality. Women worked to achieve greater equality in the workplace and politics. A growing number of women entered professions that had once been dominated by men. One way Americans in the 1970s fostered self-improvement was through fitness. Jogging became a popular fad. For joggers, running was not only a physical exercise, but also strongly connected to a spiritual movement. The photograph shows cast members from Sesame Street's Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York City in 2017. Big Bird, 7-foot tall canary, is one of the show's many famous characters. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, National Energy Act, Camp David Accords, Earth Day, 3 Mile Island accident, search for meaning, population changes, and gender equality.